The River Thames begins quietly, in a place where the land is soft and the grass grows thick. There is no grand announcement of its arrival, no dramatic surge of water. Instead, the river starts as a small trickle, barely more than a dampness in the earth, seeping from the ground in a meadow in the Cotswolds. This place is called Thames Head, though even calling it a head seems too formal for what is really just a gentle gathering of water among the reeds and wildflowers. The spring is marked by a simple stone, weathered and unassuming, and around it the ground stays damp even in the driest months. The water that emerges here has traveled through layers of limestone, filtered slowly through the rock, emerging cool and clear. In the earliest days of its journey, the Thames is so small you could step across it without much effort, a quiet stream moving between grasses, reflecting the sky in its shallow surface. The river begins its journey through countryside that rolls gently, fields divided by old hedgerows and stone walls that have stood for generations. In these upper reaches, the Thames is hardly recognizable as the broad waterway it will become. It moves through meadows where cattle graze, their hooves leaving impressions in the soft mud along the banks. The water is clear here, clear enough to see the pebbles on the bottom, worn smooth by the patient work of the current. Small fish dart between the water plants, and dragonflies hover above the surface on summer days, their wings catching the light. The river's path is not straight, but wanders according to the contours of the land, curving around hills and through valleys, taking its time as it moves eastward. There is no hurry in these upper reaches, just a steady, gentle flow that continues day after day, season after season. As the Thames moves through the Cotswolds, it passes through small villages where stone cottages sit close to the water's edge. These are quiet places, where the pace of life seems to match the speed of the river. Gardens slope down to the water, and willows lean over the banks, their branches trailing in the current. In spring, the meadows along the river are filled with wildflowers, buttercups and cow parsley, creating a soft carpet of yellow and white. The air smells of grass and water, and the only sounds are birdsong and the gentle murmur of the river moving over its stony bed. The Thames here is still young, still finding its way, but already it has begun to shape the landscape around it, creating a ribbon of life through the countryside. The river passes through Cricklade, the first town on its journey, where a stone bridge crosses the water and the banks are lined with pollarded willows. The town has grown up alongside the river, its streets and buildings arranged around the presence of the water. From here, the Thames continues through water meadows and past small hamlets, gradually growing wider and deeper as smaller streams and brooks join it. Each tributary adds its own water to the flow, and with each addition, the Thames becomes a little more substantial, a little more confident in its course. The process is gradual, almost imperceptible, but over miles and days and years, the change becomes clear. The seasons move across the river in their slow cycle, each one bringing its own character to the water and the land it passes through. In winter, the Thames often overflows its banks in the upper reaches, spreading across the meadows in shallow floods that turn the fields into temporary lakes. The water is cold and grey, reflecting the winter sky, and mist rises from the surface in the early mornings, creating a soft veil that blurs the boundaries between river and land. The trees along the banks stand bare, their branches dark against the pale sky, and the grass in the meadows is pressed flat by the weight of the water. These winter floods are part of the river's natural rhythm, a seasonal expansion that has happened for thousands of years. The water sits on the land for weeks sometimes, slowly seeping back into the river as winter turns to spring, leaving behind rich sediment that nourishes the grass. In spring, the river runs full and clear, swollen with rainwater and melting snow from the higher ground. The willows along the banks are the first to respond to the changing season, their branches taking on a yellowish tinge before the leaves emerge, bright green and soft. The meadows that were flooded in winter dry out slowly, and wildflowers begin to appear, pushing up through the grass. Lambs graze in the fields near the river, and the air is filled with the sound of birdsong as migrants return from warmer climates. The Thames in spring is a river of renewal, its water cold and energetic, moving with a purpose that seems almost eager after the stillness of winter. Swans nest along the banks, building large platforms of reeds and twigs, and moorhens paddle through the shallows, their calls echoing across the water. Summer brings a different quality to the river. The water level drops, and the Thames becomes more contained within its banks, flowing more slowly through the warm months. The surface glitters in the sunlight, and the banks are thick with vegetation, reeds and rushes growing tall and green. Dragonflies are everywhere, hovering and darting, their bodies iridescent in the bright light. The water is warmer now, and people come to the river to walk along its banks, to sit in the shade of the trees, to watch the boats that move slowly upstream and down. The pace of life along the Thames in summer is languid, matching the gentle flow of the water. Children paddle in the shallows, and fishermen sit quietly on the banks, their lines trailing in the current. The river seems almost to drowse in the heat, moving steadily but without urgency, content to flow between its banks under the wide summer sky. Autumn brings change again, a gradual cooling and a shift in the light. The trees along the river begin to turn, their leaves fading from green to yellow and gold and brown. The water reflects these colors, carrying fallen leaves downstream in slow procession. The air becomes cooler, especially in the mornings and evenings, and mist often forms above the river, hanging low over the water before the sun burns it away. The meadows beside the Thames take on the golden tones of autumn grass, and the light has a particular quality, soft and warm even as the temperature drops. Migrating birds begin to appear, stopping to rest along the river on their long journey south. The Thames in autumn is a river of transition, moving steadily through the changing landscape, carrying with it the memory of summer and the promise of winter to come. The wildlife along the Thames is varied and abundant, adapted to life in and around the water. Swans are perhaps the most visible residents, large white birds that move with surprising grace despite their size. They nest along the quieter stretches of the river, building large nests among the reeds, and they can often be seen swimming in pairs, their long necks curved in elegant arcs. Cygnets are born in late spring, fluffy gray bundles that follow their parents in orderly lines, learning the ways of the river. Swans have lived on the Thames for centuries, and in certain stretches of the river, they are protected by ancient tradition, their presence a familiar and comforting sight. Mallards and other ducks are common along the river, dabbling in the shallows and appending themselves to reach food on the river bottom. They nest in the vegetation along the banks, hidden away from predators, and in spring the females can be seen followed by long trains of ducklings, tiny and covered in down. Moorhens and coots paddle through the water, diving occasionally to search for food, their movements quick and alert. Herons stand motionless in the shallows, patient hunters waiting for fish to come within striking distance. When they catch something, they move with sudden speed, their long necks darting forward, and then they return to stillness, barely seeming to disturb the water around them. The river is home to many species of fish, though most of them remain invisible to casual observers. Pike lurk in the deeper pools, large predatory fish with streamlined bodies and sharp teeth. They stay still for long periods, hidden among the water plants, waiting for smaller fish to swim past. Perch and roach move through the water in small schools, their silvery bodies catching the light as they turn and dive. Chub gather in the slower sections of the river, and in the evening, they can sometimes be seen rising to the surface to take insects. Eels once traveled up the Thames in great numbers, making their way from the sea to the upper reaches of the river, but their numbers have declined over the years, though they are still present in some parts of the river. Otters have returned to the Thames after an absence of many decades, a sign of the improving health of the river. They are shy creatures, most active at dawn and dusk, and they move through the water with fluid grace, hunting for fish and crayfish. Their presence is often revealed by tracks in the mud along the banks or by the remains of their meals, piles of fish bones and scales left on flat rocks or logs. Otters are solitary animals for much of the year, though they come together during the breeding season, and a mother with cubs can sometimes be glimpsed teaching her young to hunt in the quieter backwaters of the river. Water voles once lived along much of the Thames, small furry creatures that made their burrows in the riverbanks and fed on the grasses and plants growing near the water. Their numbers have declined significantly due to habitat loss and predation by mink, but conservation efforts are working to protect the populations that remain. Water voles are gentle, slow-moving creatures, and they spend much of their time sitting on the banks, nibbling on vegetation, their round bodies and small ears giving them a soft, endearing appearance. The plant life along the Thames changes as the river moves through different landscapes. In the upper reaches, where the water is clear and fast-flowing, the riverbed is covered with water crowfoot, a plant with delicate white flowers that bloom on the surface while its roots anchor in the gravel below. Yellow flag irises grow in the shallows, their bright flowers adding color to the banks in late spring and early summer. Reeds and rushes become more common as the river grows wider and slower, creating dense stands along the margins where birds can nest and fish can shelter. Water lilies float on the surface of quieter sections of the river, their round leaves spread flat on the water and their flowers, white or yellow, rising above on straight stems. The lilies open during the day and close at night, a gentle rhythm that follows the movement of the sun. Beneath the surface, their long stems anchor them to the muddy bottom, and their roots spread through the sediment, drawing nutrients from the river. Water lilies provide shelter for fish and insects, and their flowers attract bees and other pollinators on warm summer days. As the Thames moves eastward from the Cotswolds, it passes through a landscape that becomes gradually less wild and more shaped by human activity. The river flows through Oxford, a city built around and alongside the water, where college buildings and church spires rise above the banks. The Thames here, often called the Isis within the city boundaries, is wider and deeper, its flow steady and purposeful. Bridges cross the river at intervals, old stone structures that have carried traffic across the water for centuries. The meadows beside the river in Oxford remain mostly open, protected from development, and in summer they are filled with people walking, picnicking, and watching the boats that glide past. The river at Oxford is busy with boats, rowing crews practicing on the water in long, narrow shells, their oars rising and falling in perfect unison. The rhythmic splash of the oars and the calls of the coxswains carry across the water sounds that have been part of the river here for generations. In summer, punts move slowly along the quieter stretches, poled by hand along the shallow sections near the banks. People recline in the boats, trailing their hands in the water, drifting in the warm afternoon sun. The river at Oxford has a particular character, a blend of natural beauty and centuries of human presence, where the water continues its ancient journey even as the city has grown up around it. Below Oxford, the Thames continues through more countryside, passing through small towns and villages, each with its own connection to the river. Abingdon sits where the river makes a wide curve, its old buildings reflecting in the water. Wallingford has a bridge that dates back centuries, a crossing point that has been important since medieval times. The river here is wide enough for larger boats, and the banks are lined with moorings where narrowboats and cabin cruisers sit quietly, their paintwork bright against the green of the water. The Thames has become a working river as well as a natural one, used for transport and recreation, yet it maintains its essential character, flowing steadily eastward, following the ancient course it carved through the landscape thousands of years ago. The river passes through Reading, a larger town where the Kennet joins the Thames, adding its water to the flow. The Thames here is fully mature, a substantial waterway with enough depth and width to carry commercial traffic in earlier centuries, though now it is mostly used by pleasure boats. The banks are more developed here, with buildings coming close to the water's edge, but parks and green spaces remain, preserving access to the river for those who want to walk alongside it or simply sit and watch the water move past. Beyond Reading, the Thames enters a stretch where it defines the boundary between Berkshire and Oxfordshire, flowing through a landscape of meadows and woods, with hills rising gently to either side. Henley sits on the river here, a town famous for its regatta, a rowing event that has taken place every summer for nearly 2 centuries. During the regatta, the river is filled with boats, and the banks are crowded with spectators, but for most of the year, Henley is quiet, the river flowing past the town much as it always has, bordered by trees and meadows, crossed by an elegant stone bridge that connects the 2 sides of the town. The river passes Marlow, where another bridge spans the water, and then moves on toward Cookham and Maidenhead, towns where the Thames has shaped the layout of streets and buildings, where the presence of the water has influenced the development of communities for centuries. The river at Maidenhead is crossed by a railway bridge designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a structure of brick and stone with wide, flat arches that allow the trains to pass high above the water. When it was built in the 19th century, many people doubted the arches would hold, but they have stood for more than 150 years, a testament to the engineering skill of their creator. Windsor sits on the river downstream from Maidenhead, dominated by the castle that rises above the town, its stone towers and walls visible for miles around. The Thames here flows beneath the castle's walls, a constant presence in the life of this royal residence. Swans gather on the river at Windsor, their white forms reflected in the water, and boats move slowly past, carrying tourists and locals alike. The river at Windsor has witnessed centuries of history, royal ceremonies, and state occasions, yet it continues its journey unchanged, flowing steadily toward London and the sea. Between Windsor and London, the Thames passes through a landscape that becomes increasingly suburban, with towns and villages merging into a more continuous development. Staines, Kingston, and Richmond all sit on the river, their histories bound up with the water that flows past them. The tidal limit of the Thames is at Teddington, where a lock and weir mark the point beyond which the river is influenced by the rise and fall of the tide. Above this point, the river's level is controlled by locks and weirs, maintaining a steady depth for navigation. Below it, the river becomes tidal, its level rising and falling twice each day with the rhythm of the sea. The Thames in London is a different river from the gentle stream that rises in the Cotswolds. Here it is wide and strong, its waters dark with sediment, flowing between high banks and embankments. The river has been shaped by centuries of human activity, its course straightened in places, its banks reinforced with stone and concrete. Yet even here, in the heart of a great city, the Thames maintains its essential character as a living waterway. Birds nest along its banks, fish swim in its waters, and the tide flows in and out with the same ancient rhythm that has governed it for millennia. The bridges that cross the Thames in London are landmarks in themselves, each with its own history and character. Tower Bridge is perhaps the most famous, its twin towers and lifting roadway instantly recognizable. London Bridge has stood in various forms for nearly 2,000 years, each iteration replaced when age or damage made it necessary. Westminster Bridge offers views of the Houses of Parliament, while Blackfriars, Waterloo, and others span the river at intervals, connecting the two sides of the city, allowing the constant flow of people and traffic across the water. The Thames Barrier sits downstream from the city centre, a row of massive steel gates that can be raised to protect London from flooding during exceptionally high tides. When not in use, the gates rest on the river bottom, allowing water and boats to pass freely. The barrier was completed in the 1980s, a response to the increasing risk of tidal flooding, and it stands as both a piece of functional infrastructure and a striking example of modern engineering. The river flows through the barrier's piers, moving steadily toward the sea, unaffected by the presence of these structures except when they are raised to hold back the tide. Below London, the Thames widens into an estuary, its banks becoming mudflats that are exposed at low tide and covered at high tide. This is a landscape of greys and browns, of mud and water, where wading birds probe the flats for food and seals sometimes venture up from the sea. The estuary is a transitional zone, neither fully river nor fully sea, where fresh water meets salt water and mixes in a gradual transition. The water here is murky, filled with sediment carried down from the upper reaches of the river, deposited in the estuary as the current slows and the tide exerts its influence. Ships move through the estuary, large vessels heading to and from the ports that line the lower Thames. The river has been a highway for trade for centuries, bringing goods from around the world to London and carrying exports away. Docks and wharves line the banks, and cranes rise above the water, loading and unloading cargo. Yet even here, among all this industrial activity, the river continues its ancient journey, flowing steadily toward the sea, carrying with it the water that fell as rain on the Cotswolds and travelled hundreds of miles to reach this point. The Thames finally meets the North Sea in a wide, open expanse where the river loses its distinct identity and becomes part of the ocean. The exact point where river becomes sea is impossible to define, a gradual transition rather than a clear boundary. The water that began as a trickle in a Cotswold meadow has traveled more than 200 miles, passing through countryside and towns and a great city, gathering the waters of dozens of tributaries, shaped by seasons and tides, influenced by human activity yet maintaining its essential nature as a river. The journey from source to sea takes weeks for a drop of water, moving with the current, joining with other drops, becoming part of the vast flow that is the Thames. The history of the Thames is inseparable from the history of England. The river has been a route for traders and invaders, a source of food and water, a barrier and a highway, a place of work and recreation. The Romans built the first London Bridge, establishing a crossing point that would become the nucleus of a great city. They recognized the strategic importance of the river, using it to supply their settlements and to move troops and goods. After the Romans left, others came, Saxons and Vikings, using the river to penetrate deep into the English countryside. The Thames has witnessed battles and treaties, coronations and revolutions, its waters flowing steadily through all the events of human history that have unfolded along its banks. In medieval times, the Thames was London's main thoroughfare, with thousands of small boats ferrying people and goods across the water and up and down the river. The old London Bridge was lined with houses and shops, and it was one of the wonders of medieval England, though it also made the river more difficult to navigate, with water rushing through the narrow arches at dangerous speeds. Shooting the bridge, as it was called, required skill and courage, and many boats were overturned attempting it. The bridge stood for more than 600 years before it was finally replaced in the 19th century with a new structure better suited to modern traffic. The Thames has frozen over completely on several occasions in history, most famously during the Little Ice Age when winters were particularly severe. During these frost fairs, as they were called, the river became a solid platform of ice thick enough to support tents and stalls, and Londoners would venture onto the frozen Thames to buy food and drink, to watch entertainments, and to marvel at the transformation of their river into a temporary street. The last frost fair took place in the early 19th century, and changes to the river, including the removal of the old London Bridge and the construction of embankments, mean that the Thames no longer freezes in the same way. The Thames has inspired countless works of art and literature over the centuries. Writers have described its changing moods, its beauty and its utility. Painters have captured its light and its reflections, the way buildings and bridges and boats are mirrored in its surface. The river appears in novels and poems, in paintings and photographs, a constant presence in the cultural life of England. It is a river that has been loved and studied, complained about and celebrated, a waterway that has shaped the imagination of generations. There are legends associated with the Thames, stories that have been passed down through centuries. Some say that the river has spirits that protect it, that certain places along its banks are sacred or haunted. Old Father Thames is a personification of the river, depicted as a bearded man reclining beside the water, a figure that represents the river's ancient presence and its patient, enduring nature. These stories and symbols reflect the deep connection that people have felt to the Thames, a relationship that goes beyond the practical use of the water to something more emotional and spiritual. The Thames has also been, at various times, severely polluted. In the 19th century, as London's population grew rapidly and sewage systems struggled to keep pace, the river became an open sore, its waters foul and dangerous. The Great Stink of 1858, when a hot summer caused the smell from the river to become unbearable, finally prompted action, and a new sewage system was built to carry waste away from the Thames. Over the following decades, efforts to clean the river continued, and by the late 20th century, the Thames had recovered significantly, with fish returning to waters where they had been absent for more than a century. Today, the Thames is monitored and managed, its water quality maintained through regulation and treatment of the waste that enters it. The river supports a diverse ecosystem, with more than 100 species of fish recorded in its waters, and seals now regularly swim up from the estuary into the tidal reaches of the river. The return of wildlife to the Thames is a success story, evidence that human activity and nature can coexist when care is taken to protect and restore the environment. The Thames Path is a walking route that follows the river for most of its length, from the source in the Cotswolds to the Thames Barrier in London. The path allows people to experience the river intimately, to walk alongside it through countryside and towns, to observe the changes in the landscape and the character of the water as it moves from narrow stream to broad tidal river. Walking the Thames Path is a journey through history and nature, past meadows and lochs, through villages and cities, always with the river as a companion, its presence a constant in a changing landscape. The lochs on the Thames are places where the river is managed, where the level is controlled to allow boats to pass upstream and downstream. Each loch has a keeper who operates the gates and sluices, raising or lowering the water level in the loch chamber to match either the upstream or downstream level. Boats entering a loch must wait while the chamber fills or empties, a process that takes several minutes, and during this time, there is a particular sense of being between two levels, suspended in a transitional space. The lochs have names that reflect their locations and histories, and many have been operating for more than a century, maintained and upgraded but still serving their original purpose. Weirs are structures that control the flow of the river, allowing excess water to spill over or through while maintaining a steady level upstream. The sound of water flowing over a weir is one of the characteristic sounds of the Thames, a rushing, tumbling noise that carries across the river and can be heard from some distance away. Weirs create turbulent water downstream, where the river is white with foam and air, before it settles again into its steady flow. Fish gather below weirs, taking advantage of the oxygenated water and the food that is carried over with the current. Islands sit in the Thames at various points along its length, places where the river has divided around obstacles or where sediment has built up over time. Some islands are inhabited, with houses and bridges connecting them to the mainland, while others are left wild, covered with trees and vegetation, home to birds and other wildlife. Eel Pie Island in Twickenham is one such place, known for its bohemian past and its community of artists and musicians. Other islands are smaller, barely more than raised sandbanks, but they provide important habitat for nesting birds and contribute to the ecological diversity of the river. The Thames is measured not just in miles but in the time it takes to travel its length. For a rowing crew, the journey from Lechlade to Teddington takes several days of hard work, fighting against the current, passing through loch after loch. For a pleasure cruiser, moving at a more leisurely pace, the journey might take a week or more, with stops along the way to explore riverside towns and to moor for the night. For the water itself, the journey from source to sea is even slower, a gradual progression that depends on rainfall and season, on the volume of water entering the river and the speed of the current. A drop of water might take weeks or even months to complete the journey, moving with the flow, mixing with other drops, evaporating and falling as rain again before finally reaching the sea. The river continues to change, shaped by natural processes and human intervention. Climate change is affecting the Thames, with changing rainfall patterns leading to more frequent flooding in some areas and lower water levels in others. Rising sea levels mean that the threat of tidal flooding is increasing, and the Thames barrier may need to be raised more frequently in the coming years. Yet the river adapts, as it has always adapted, finding new equilibriums, new ways of flowing through the landscape. The Thames has survived ice ages and warm periods, has cut new channels and abandoned old ones, has risen and fallen in response to the forces that shape the earth. The Thames is a working river still, though the nature of that work has changed. Where once it carried cargo ships and barges laden with goods, now it carries mostly pleasure craft, people seeking recreation and relaxation on the water. The river provides water for drinking and industry, though treatment is necessary to make it safe. It provides power, with hydroelectric schemes at some weirs generating electricity from the flow of water. It provides transport, with river buses carrying commuters and tourists along its length in London. And it provides beauty, a green corridor through the landscape, a place where people can walk and cycle, where they can sit and watch the water flow past, finding peace in the constant movement of the river. In winter evenings, when darkness comes early, the lights of towns and cities reflect on the surface of the Thames, creating patterns of gold and silver on the dark water. The river continues to flow through the night, unseen by most but always present, moving steadily toward the sea. In the quieter reaches, away from the lights, the Thames is dark and mysterious, its surface barely visible, but the sound of the water continues, a soft murmur that speaks of movement and continuity. The stars reflect in the water when the sky is clear, and the moon, when it rises, traces a silver path across the surface, a path that moves with the current, constantly shifting but always there. The Thames in moonlight has a particular quality, peaceful and timeless. The water seems to absorb the light, reflecting it back in a softer form, and the banks are reduced to dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. This is the river in its most essential form, freed from the details of day, existing simply as water and light and movement. Night creatures move along the banks, foxes and badgers coming down to drink, owls hunting over the meadows, bats skimming the surface of the water to catch insects. The river continues its journey through the darkness, patient and persistent, following the path it has followed for thousands of years. The seasons turn, and the river responds to each in its own way. Spring brings renewal, summer brings warmth and growth, autumn brings change and preparation, winter brings cold and rest. But through all these changes, the Thames continues, a constant presence in a changing world. The water that flows in the river today will be in the sea tomorrow, but more water will take its place, flowing from the source, following the same path, continuing the endless cycle. The river connects past and present, source and sea, upland and lowland, carrying with it the memory of rain that fell on distant hills and the promise of the ocean that waits downstream. The Thames is a river of layers, of history and nature, of human use and wildlife. It is a place where ancient and modern coexist, where medieval bridges stand alongside contemporary buildings, where wildlife thrives in the midst of human habitation. It is a river that has shaped the land it flows through and has been shaped by that land in return. It is a river that has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the growth of a great city, the lives of millions of people who have lived along its banks. And through it all, the river has continued to flow, patient and enduring, a thread of water connecting the heart of England to the sea. The water moves slowly here in these thoughts, drifting through images of the river, scenes that blend into one another like reflections on the surface. There is the quiet meadow where the Thames begins, hardly more than a trickle, and there is the wide estuary where it meets the sea, and between them lie all the miles and moments, all the places and creatures, all the history and life that the river has touched. The Thames is not just water but a story, not just a physical feature but a living presence, something that exists in the landscape and in the imagination, in the memory and in the moment. Thinking of the river is like watching water flow, a meditation on movement and change, on persistence and adaptation. The Thames has been flowing for longer than human memory, longer than human history, cutting its valley through the landscape grain by grain, year by year, century by century. It will continue to flow long after we are gone, carrying water from the hills to the sea, sustaining life along its banks, reflecting the sky above. This thought is somehow comforting, this sense of the river's continuity, its indifference to human concerns, its patient persistence. The river invites stillness, invites us to slow down and match its pace, to sit beside the water and let thoughts drift like leaves on the current. There is something about moving water that quiets the mind, that brings a sense of peace. Perhaps it is the repetition, the constant motion that is always the same yet always different. Perhaps it is the sound, the gentle murmur that masks other noises and creates a cocoon of calm. Perhaps it is simply the presence of the water itself, ancient and elemental, a reminder of forces larger than ourselves and rhythms deeper than our daily concerns. The Thames flows on, through day and night, through seasons and years. It carries rainwater and melted snow, autumn leaves and spring flowers, fish and insects, history and stories. It moves beneath bridges and past towns, through countryside and cities, always heading toward the sea. And in its flowing, it creates a constant background to life along its banks, a presence that is so familiar it is often unnoticed, yet so essential it would leave a void if it were gone. The river is always there, always moving, always the same, always different, a paradox of constancy and change. As thoughts of the river drift and fade, the image that remains is simple: water flowing between banks, moving steadily downstream, catching the light, reflecting the sky, continuing its ancient journey. The Thames, from source to sea, a river that connects and sustains, that endures and adapts, that flows through the landscape and through our awareness, gentle and persistent, quiet and strong, always moving, always there, a silver thread through the fabric of England, water finding its way to the sea. The river whispers its own constant song, not in words but in the sound of water moving, a soft rushing and murmuring that continues without pause. This is the voice of the Thames, speaking in a language older than human speech, telling a story that has no beginning and no end, only the endless middle of flowing water. Listen to that sound in your mind, the gentle rush of a river moving steadily through its valley, and let it carry you along, drifting like a leaf on the current, moving with the water toward sleep, toward rest, toward the quiet darkness where thoughts dissolve and consciousness fades into the peaceful depths of the night. The Thames flows on, and in our imagination we flow with it, letting go of the day, releasing tension and worry, allowing the river to carry us gently downstream toward rest. The water is cool and clear, the movement is steady and sure, and there is nothing to do but let go, to drift, to sink softly into sleep as the river continues its patient journey to the sea. The Thames flows on, always flowing, always there, a constant presence in the landscape and in these fading thoughts, water moving through the night, carrying us gently toward sleep, toward peace, toward the quiet stillness that waits at the end of waking thought. The river continues, and we continue with it, drifting now in that space between waking and sleeping, awareness fading like light on water as evening turns to night. The Thames flows on through the darkness, unseen but always present, always moving, always there, and in its flowing there is comfort, there is peace, there is the gentle invitation to let go and drift, to release the day and sink into the soft darkness of sleep. The river flows on, and we flow with it, letting go, drifting downstream on the patient current, toward rest, toward sleep, toward the quiet depths where the river meets the sea and all thoughts dissolve into peaceful darkness.